Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am here for my LCK Week 8 overview, analysis, and of course at the end, my updated power rankings. It's the LCK time in the week again, and I'm very excited to get into it. It's the only region that I'm covering on the channel that has not started playoffs yet, and so definitely a little bit of a weird atmosphere just surrounding the LCK, what with the regular season just still ongoing, and so many things feeling kind of solidified in the LCK. Top 5, or really top 4 at the moment, at least in terms of current form. Teams playing relatively well, and then like the bottom 5 teams just not being all that good here in the LCK. It's a pretty interesting dynamic that we're not getting in the playoffs in basically any of the other regions, but still a lot of merit to be going over the regular season. A lot of these teams are still showing us exactly what they have, and remember, the playoffs in the LCK are a little bit shorter because only 6 teams end up making it. It's not really this giant bracket, and so it is something where you do need to, take a little bit more of the regular season into account when you go into the back half of the season. So these games are definitely still important, but would love to know what you guys thought of them down in the comments section below. What teams are impressing you, what teams are not impressing you, what players are impressing you, what players are disappointing you at the current moment. Obviously, a lot of things really starting to make themselves clear in the LCK, and we're going to find out a lot more by the end of this week, but only 2 weeks remain in the regular season, and so if you're going to be getting into some of those playoff spots, you better get in soon. But without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into it. Of course, if you're new here, what we're going to do is go series by series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series for all 10 series across all 5 days, and at the end of the week, I'll give you guys my updated power rankings, as well as a player of the week and a dud of the week for all of week number 8. But let's jump right in to day number 1, the first day of action, of course, and, the first of the 5, and we kicked off day number 1 with a matchup between Gen.G and Liiv SANDBOX, and Gen.G is able to get the job done. They're able to take the series 2-0, which they should be able to do. Obviously, they are the better team. These games were a little bit slower than maybe you would expect as Gen.G going into SANDBOX, but remember, I'm going to keep probably bringing this up about 1,000 times over the course of this video. SANDBOX might be 4-10, 4-11 now after the series, but they are very much still in the playoff race. Like 5, 6, probably 6 wins gets you into playoffs, and so SANDBOX definitely not completely eliminated yet. It's unfortunate they have to play one of the top 2 teams in the league to kind of get there, though, and so Gen.G being able to pick up the win, it's not surprising, but, you definitely, want to have some form if you're one of the bottom teams. Nobody is eliminated from playoff contention with that number 6 seed so up in the air at the current moment, but massive win from Gen.G. They continue to pull out some of the picks that they've been really successful on over the course of this entire year up until this point. Most notably, the Zeri in the bot lane. Player of the series for me, pretty obviously going to go to Pays. He's been so spectacular over the course of this year. I think for a lot of people, me included, he is the front runner for MVP at the current moment. It's just been such a massive positive for what Gen.G has wanted to do. Obviously, this team hasn't exactly, been as much of a news grabber or an attention grabber over the course of the last few weeks because of KT Rolster and just how well that team is playing at the moment, but it's not like Gen.G has completely fallen off. They've only lost to KT, and so they're still playing at a very high level, and Pays has still been incredibly consistent. He played the Samira in game number 1 and was certainly the more active ADC in that game, and then he's really getting player of the series for that Zeri in game number 2, which just was an incredibly dominant performance. 19, 3, and 12. That's a hell of a series going into SANDBOX. I think the rest of the team played great. One player that I don't think is going to get nearly as much attention as he deserves is Doran in the top lane, who again just continues to be awesome. Really, it's him and Keen and then every other top laner in the LCK. Like, there really is a big difference. I think Doran, in a lot of different circumstances in this kind of form, would be considered the best top laner in the LCK in a lot of different seasons, but because Keen has been stepping up so much, I do think Doran's getting a little bit overshadowed in that respect. I don't think he deserves it, though. He's been playing out of his mind. This is the best split of his entire career, in my opinion, and he just continues to be a massive positive this time on the Jax. Really good series overall. Chovy and Delight were awesome in both games, especially game 1. Peanut was really good at being able to set the tempo early, was much better than Willer, again, especially in that game number 1, but Gen.G in general was just so much better than what SANDBOX was offering on the other side of the map that it's really not a hard decision to say, like, everybody was playing well, right? Everybody was playing well on the side of Gen.G, and That's what you want to see in a matchup between one of the top teams and one of the bottom teams. But for SANDBOX on the other side, not a good series. Again, you're still in the playoff run. Like, you're still in the hunt, which is insane to say at 4-11. But even if you were at 3 wins, technically you wouldn't be eliminated from the playoffs just yet, because that 6 seed, right now, I think it's held by someone with 4 wins. And so, pretty insane, situation that we are in. But SANDBOX losing here is definitely disappointing. And just a lot of these players have disappointed so much in summer. It feels like they've regressed so much from where they've been at other parts of their careers. Specifically, my dud of the series, Kale, in the support position. He's been so good. I've been so high on him over the course of his career, and he's been good with a variety of AD carries. Obviously, was great with Prince last year, but was really good with Envy in spring as well. And Envy's not some superstar. We certainly saw that in the LPL this split, when he couldn't even stay on the Rift for one of the worst teams in the league. Kale is just not been good this split, and I can't exactly tell you why. Things are just not necessarily working out for him, but he was really bad in this series on the Rel, on the Nautilus. Just felt very disconnected from the rest of his team, would consistently go in and get blown up basically immediately, and not actually do a whole ton for the game, which is disappointing. But I know a lot of people are saying Teddy is elo held. I've pushed back on that narrative a lot on this channel over this split, and I think this series is a good example of why. That Varus in Game 1 was bad. And like, yes, I get that his score lines look good, and if you just look at the score lines, I can understand why you would think that Teddy is elo held, because consistently he probably has the best scoreline. But you watch these games, it's not like he's making plays. It's not like he's trying to win. He's just kind of sitting there and waiting for the rest of the team to either do something or not do something. And because they're not doing anything, Teddy's losing. And that's kind of been the problem with Teddy on losing teams throughout his career sometimes. Now, it's not always been the case. Teddy's definitely had moments where he's been elo held, and obviously he's very talented, but he's not aggressive. He's not someone that's going to step up and like force the game to go in his direction. He's just going to kind of see how the game ends up playing out, and he'll either win or lose because of it. He will help you win in the sense that if the rest of your team is winning, he's going to do, the things well towards the back half of the game. If you put resources into him, he'll pay them out. But the problem with that is, like, he just doesn't create his own advantages. And I think that's never been more apparent than this split on SANDBOX. And I think that was clear in this series. Clear in particular actually kind of got run over. Clear's been pretty good for SANDBOX. I don't think he's been a negative for this team. Has certainly been better than what Bertle was in the summer split, even if I really liked Bertle's spring split. But, only so much you can do going into Doran, who's one of the best top laners in the world at the moment. Willer just gets out-jungled every single game at this point. He's the other player on this team that's just completely regressed from whatever his spring form was. And Closer, I think, was okay, was dealing damage on the Azir, but was out-pressured so much in terms of map prio by Chovy. And I know that a lot of that is going to come in the jungle matchup, but Azir into Yone, like, the Azir is going to need to scale up. He's not necessarily going to have that priority to move around the map and be active in the mid game like Chovy on the Yone was, and so you're just going to naturally lose pressure, and if the rest of your map is losing, like, the Azir's just not going to be able to make up for that. And so SANDBOX falling 0-2 here, again, it's not surprising, but a lot of the same things that have plagued them over the course of this split, I think, definitely appeared in the series. And then for Gen.G on the other side, they're still really, really good. One of the top 2 teams in the LCK. Again, I know a lot of the spotlight has gone on KT Rolster, but that shouldn't mean that we completely stop talking about how good Gen.G has been. And then moving on to our second series of day number 1 here, and it's another matchup between a top team and a kind of bottom team at the current moment. We have the Kwangdong Freecs taking on KT Rolster. And KT is going to be able to pick up the 2-0 series win. Again, no surprise here. KDF has been an absolute tragedy over the past couple of weeks. They have not been able to win games, let alone series, to save their lives. They have very quickly, in my opinion, become the worst team in the LCK. I understand that, like, a lot of people are still holding out hope that, the schedule has been hard. It's not been hard. They've lost to the worst teams in the league consistently. I think all of the other, bottom teams in the league, SANDBOX, DRX, Bro, they've all beaten KDF over the last couple of weeks. It's not like they're just losing to the best teams over and over again. KDF has been bad, and KT's been the best team in the league. They just took down Gen.G last week and were able to really establish their claim as the #1 team in the LCK, and they were able to follow that up here with a win. Now, I want to quickly touch on the narrative surrounding this series, because as great as it is that KT was able to take down KDF, it's not a particularly surprising outcome. But the only thing that people are taking away from this series is, OMG, Zeri back, insert gif of, someone slamming on their keyboard, right? I hate this argument and I hate this debate so much, and I don't usually complain at the beginning of these videos because usually I try to save it towards the middle or the end because I know the people that aren't all that interested in the content are probably going to stop watching by then. Like, you don't watch 45 minutes into a video that you're not interested in, and so unfortunately you're going to be getting this 9 minutes in this time, but I just don't understand the Zeri hate in the current meta. Like, I get it, you're fatigued, I get it, you know, Zeri's been everywhere, but if you can honestly, like, look me in the eyes and tell me that you dislike watching Zeri in Pro more than, like, Kog'Maw or Kai'Sa, or AP Kai'Sa in particular, I don't think we can agree. Like, I just don't understand. I don't get it. Zeri's not broken. Zeri's not overpowered. Zeri is not an insta-win. You know what Zeri is? Zeri's a champion that gives really good AD carries everything they need to be really good. Like, and that's a great pro champion design, in my opinion. Have there been a lot of times where Zeri's been broken? Absolutely. There was a reason she was the highest played AD carry for forever, you know, especially when the W was super strong, but even just her ability to consistently win team fights, like, yes, Zeri has a lot of tools, and a lot of them, you know, are very, very strong, but what has been very clear, and especially now after she's been nerfed, is that really good AD carries are going to look good on the champion, but if you give Zeri to, like, Taiyun on the other side of this matchup, which didn't get it in this series, but if you give it to the worst AD carry out of the two, they're not going to be able to do anything on the champion. This is a champion that really does accentuate a lot of the strengths of a good player and punishes a bad player for not being able to space and position and, you know, basically play perfectly. And so I like Zeri for the pro scene. I actually think she's positive, yet, you know, I get it, like, fatigue and the champion that everybody's seen, but God, like, I see a lot of people celebrating the Kai'Sa Kog'Maw meta, and I'm like, we cannot be watching the same games. I would so much rather see Zeri have to space perfectly and, you know, consistently pump out damage and, you know, make sure that she can peel for herself or allow her team to play around it. I would so much rather see that kind of coordinated gameplay towards the back half of games than Kog'Maw standing 5,000 feet away and just firing off ultimates, or AP Kai'Sa just throwing W's out every 2 seconds, or Jace, you know, throwing out shock blasts. Like, I would so much rather see Zeri than any of that, in my personal opinion. Now, again, maybe some people disagree, and you can let me know down in the comment section below, but talking about this game in general, the only reason I bring that up is because it's the entire conversation on social media surrounding both of these games is, OMG, Zeri OP, can't believe Zeri back. And I disagree with it personally, and I wanted to make that clear on this channel, but KT did play it really well. Aiming still really, really good, was very close to giving him player of the series because Zeri was very strong, but I'm going to give it to Cuz. Cuz was fantastic here. Everybody on this team has really pulled their weight, and Cuz has certainly not been the exception to that. He's kind of been the one that I think has taken more of a secondary, you know, facilitative role in summer in particular. I think he was much more of a carry in spring, but with Keen and BDD and Aiming all really kind of emerging, even Lehen's kind of emerging as these big playmakers, Cuz has kind of been the one that I think has flown under the radar. That does not mean he's not been one of the best junglers in the LCK, though. Still has been fantastic, and the Poppy series was great, but like I said, Aiming and Lehen still did a really good job. BDD and Keen were also really good. I know the Keen, you know, memes are all really funny, and I think he's been fantastic. Going into a really good top laner in Dudu, I thought he did well, but everybody on KT Rolster won in this matchup. I just wanted to make it clear that I don't think it's because they picked Zeri. I think the reason that Zeri looked OP is because KT is the better team, if that makes sense. I don't know if I'm getting that across well. I think if KDF had played 2 games of Zeri, the pick would have looked completely useless. I think that's where the champion is at the current moment. But for KDF on the other side, the reason I think Zeri would have looked useless is because they are so clearly the worst team out of these two. And it's not just these two. This team is struggling so much right now. Youngjae's been kind of transitioning into more of a carry role. He's really not done that at the LCK level over the course of the beginning part of his career here on KDF. Maybe he's going to be able to do it. Maybe he's the saving grace, but the Nocturne, the Kazakhs, like, they're not working out in this series. Cuz was certainly ahead of him in terms of pressure, and especially in that game 1 was just able to create so much because the Nocturne didn't have anything to do. And then, you know, the rest of these players have also regressed quite a bit. The bottom side of the map is not good. Andil, whatever his name is, he's been awful ever since he came in for KDF. A massive downgrade to anybody that's been in the bot lane for them, whether it's been June or wherever Moham is at the current moment. And then dud of the game is going to go to, or dud of the series is going to go to Taiyun in the bot lane, who is probably the single worst player in the LCK at the current moment. I hate saying that, but he is such a hindrance towards this team. You know, Bulldogs, you know, had some major regression over the course of this split. He's legit been one of the worst mid laners in the LCK in summer, but Taiyun is really the reason this team cannot compete. They looked destined for a top 6 seed in the summer split here, for a playoff berth, but this bot lane has actually been so bad that they've dragged them down into maybe being the worst team in the LCK. And that's really unfortunate. We were concerned about that going into the split, and basically all of our fears have come true in that respect. I still like Dudu a lot, and I still think he's easily the best player on this team, but even he is not necessarily performing up to standard right now. The K'Sante really wasn't working in that same way, and obviously K'Sante's also been nerfed. He's still really strong and still has a lot of tools, but isn't going to be like this auto win, especially going into something like Rumble, who I think is just generally stronger than K'Sante at the moment. And so for KDF, like, I'm not gonna, I mean, it is panic time. I'm not gonna say it's not panic time, right? Like, this was a team that no-brainer should be a top 6 team in the LCK with how they started the split, but they're legit like 2-14 in their last 16 games. It's been actually miserable for them, and if they can't figure something out, like, they're going to consistently be the worst team in the league, and they're going to throw away a chance that they had at getting into playoffs. But for KT Rolster, they're the best team in the LCK, you know, Zeri or not. They're going to be able to dominate a series like this, and it's just really good to see a team like this continue to be consistent over the course of an entire split. And then moving on now to day number 2, our second day, and we kicked it off with another little bit of an upset, but at this point, can you even really call it that? We had T1 taking on DRX, and DRX was able to pick up the win because of course they were. Of course DRX 2-0s T1 this split. Like, what else could possibly happen? T1 is completely fallen apart. They were, what, 6-2 at the beginning of this split? They're now sitting at 7-8 without Faker. It's been absurd. It's been not good at all for them. They were able to win game number 1 at the very least. They were able to take a game, and I'll kind of talk about that. I do think that there are a couple of players on this team that are maybe getting lumped in with the others that don't necessarily deserve to be as lumped in with the others, in my opinion, even if they are inconsistent. But for DRX, this is a massive win because it gets you to 4-11, and guess what? That puts you tied for 6th in the LCK right now. I know that's a crazy thing to say, but that puts you tied for a playoff spot, which is absurd. But yeah, you're right there, and if DRX can get hot at the right time, like, who's to say they can't get into the playoffs right now as that number 6 seed? We all kind of thought that they would be in the playoff race at the beginning of the year back in January, but obviously so much has happened since then. Things have certainly not gone the way that they've expected, but the wins over T1 have certainly helped their case. It's half of their wins this split, which is actually insane. But player of the series for me was actually kind of difficult. I think DRX, for the most part, kind of won as a team rather than any individual players just kind of dominating and stepping up. But I'm going to go ahead and give it to Paddock in the bot lane. Thought he was really solid on the Xayah in particular in game number 3 going into Gumayushi, who's kind of been easily the best player on T1 ever since Faker had to step down. I thought Paddock was actually really solid. Really interesting player. He's someone who I haven't talked about a ton. I know that, like, I'm kind of in the middle on him, and I still believe that I'm in the middle on him in terms of his outcomes, because he really has not been a problem for a DRX team that has really struggled. It's been other positions that have been in fact, he's probably been the least amount of a problem of anybody on the team. Rascal, Krako, Fate, Beryl, even, like, Yehu, and even, like, Juhan, like, I think all of them have had worse games than what Paddock has had. The problem is that Paddock sometimes just puts himself in really bad positions, and that's going to happen every once in a while, and he's not necessarily always going to be a winning player. I just don't necessarily think he's, like, a losing player. He doesn't get bodied in laning phase or anything like that. He's been serviceable as an AD carry, and he's had a couple of games where he's been really good. I would argue he's been the most valuable player to DRX over the course of this split, if only just because everybody else has been bad, but, you know, I don't think his upside is ever going to be, like, dominating. Now, maybe he can clean up a lot of the mistakes, and maybe he can bring out the mechanical skill that we know is there. It's just kind of been a little bit of a struggle for him to play super consistently, but this was a good series against a good bot lane, and he's honestly had more of these than I think people give him credit for, but rest of the team was also good. I was actually very close to giving this to Beryl. I've obviously been very critical of Beryl for good reason over the course of the last, like, what, 3 years now? All of his time on DRX, well, 2 years, I guess. All of his time on DRX, I think, has been very inconsistent. Even last year when they won the World Championships, he was miserable in the regular season. In summer, he just kind of got hot at the right time and was really good at Worlds, but, you know, Beryl was really solid against T1. Name a better duo. Like, he's dominated this organization basically no matter who he's played for, whether it's Damwon or whether it's DRX. He's always been very good into T1, and that continued in this series. One of his better series of the year up until this point. Fate was certainly good, especially in that game number 2 on the Tristana, where he really was able to take over the mid game. Krako, I think, has actually been really solid ever since he came back in as the full-time starter for Juhan. Juhan's just kind of whatever. I know people really like him, but I've never really seen him as like this dominating jungler. He has his own problems for sure in terms of being too passive, and I think Krako does try to make plays when he goes into a jungler that he can out-pressure and out-tempo. He actually has played really well. Like the last 5 or so series for Krako have actually been fine, in my opinion. Rascal has certainly had his major problems this split. He's had a couple of games where he's almost solo lost for the team, but he was good in this series. Was definitely better than Zeus down the back half, even if I don't really like the Renekton game in game 1. I think the 2 games of Cassante more than made up for it. So for DRX, it's actually a relatively nice win, and for T1, like, this is disaster. You need something to change. Like, it's not just Poby in the mid lane. Like, he is going to get my dud of the series here, and we'll talk about that because I think individually speaking, he was the worst player in this particular series, but it really isn't just Poby that is causing problems. Now, I did say at the beginning that I think some players are getting undervalued. Gumayushi, I think everybody knows, has been kind of the good player on this team, but I think Zeus has kind of been undervalued by a lot of fans for what he's been able to do while Faker has been gone. Yes, he's had some really tragically bad games, and Zeus in general, I think, is more of a feast or famine player because, you know, he really tries to skill check you in laning phase, even on bad matchups, and that in the top lane is going to lead to some bad situations, but I do think that he also he's one of the few players that can just straight up win T1 games, and he did that in game 1 on the Gnar, in my opinion. Their win was pretty directly contributed to by Zeus, and so, you know, those are the 2 players I want to shout out, but honestly, Owner has been horrific ever since Faker left. He has been legit one of the worst junglers in the LCK. That continued in this series. Poby certainly hasn't stepped up, but I don't blame him. The kid's like 17 years old, 18 years old, and has barely played professionally and now has to step into T1. That's a hard situation to put him in, and just because he hasn't been very good, you know, doesn't mean that that's not what was expected, but Keria certainly has not been consistent at all in the bot lane. I think his laning has been fine, but his team fighting has been a major error and a major issue for this team. I just don't really know what's going on with T1, and until, you know, Faker comes back and, you know, rights the ship, or maybe Faker comes back and doesn't right the ship, it's hard to really know what this T1 team is actually looking like, but it certainly does raise a lot of concerns, not only for, you know, being able to do well in the playoffs, but for qualifying for Worlds just in general. They don't feel like a top 4 team in the LCK right now, and that's where you need to be in order to qualify for the World Championships. And so, certainly going to be interesting moving down the stretch of this split, but T1 not looking good. DRX with a nice win, and again, if they can get hot at the right time, who's to say they can't end up making playoffs? It's really hard to ever bet on DRX with how they've played over the course of this year, but again, the bottom of this league is so in disarray right now that really, what's stopping them? And then moving on to our second series of day number 2 here. And again, every matchup really matters at this point in the LCK. We had a matchup between Hanwha Liiv Esports and Nongshim RedForce that Hanwha is going to be able to take, and this team really has been streaking. They've been basically the best version of themselves over the past few weeks, and I think that that's kind of gone under the radar, if you will, because of how good Gen.G and KT Rolster have been. A lot of people are saying that they are definitively the top 2 in the league, and while I do kind of agree with that, Hanwha Liiv over the past, like, 3 weeks has been easily the 3rd best team in the LCK, and it's been a lot of fun to watch. It feels like everything that was kind of wrong with this team has kind of been fixed with Grizzly coming in. A lot of the underperformances from some of the other players have, you know, really corrected themselves, and a lot of, you know, the middle tier players on this team are stepping up and being massive positives again as we get further down the stretch for this team. And so, honestly, I'm really in on them right now. They're playing really good League of Legends, and I think there is a pretty strong case to be made that they're not going to be nearly as easy of an out as basically anybody else in the LCK playoffs. And so, you know, before we get into that, obviously, with them having locked their spot a couple of weeks ago, let's talk about this series. Player of the series pretty easily going to go to Zeka in the mid lane. Oh my god, 2 unbelievably good Tristana games. I feel like Zeka at this point has so thoroughly demolished the 2-trick or 3-trick allegations or whatever people were throwing at him at Worlds last year, because he can just play so many different champions at such a high level. Yes, he's kind of like a playstyle one-trick champion, if you will. Like, he's got one playstyle that he likes to play, but there are so many different ways for him to be able to play that playstyle, and it's not like he can't facilitate for the rest of this team. I just think that this team is going to be at their best when they're playing through him in the mid lane, and that was very much on display in this series, where Grizzly was able to generate large leads in terms of the jungle matchup, in terms of pressure, even if his individual mechanics weren't all that good in the series, and really allows Zeka to just kind of take over and win the game for him, and I think that that's fine. You know, if Hanwha can play through Zeka and just kind of allow him to absolutely smurf every game, like that, DRX did that for a lot of Worlds last year and ended up winning the World Championships, and so I don't think it's a bad strategy at all. I think the rest of this team, like I said, has been stepping up. Grizzly has been phenomenal, was player of the week last week in week number 7 for me, continued to be really good in this series going into Sylvie. Kingen in the top lane. I know I haven't really talked about him a ton, but he's actually been really good over the past few weeks. Certainly one of the better top laners in the LCK, one of the more consistent ones. Kingen and stepping up, as the season gets closer to an end, name a better duo. Very, very good stuff from Kingen here. Going into Din, who again isn't really a very good top laner, especially at the LCK level, but Kingen has consistently been very good, even against other good top laners. And then Viper and Liiv, I think, are finally on the same page. Viper hasn't necessarily been like this dominant hyper carry like he has been in some previous weeks for this team, but I think that's mostly because the rest of this roster is actually stepping up, and Viper doesn't necessarily need to be this dynamic hyper carry, right? You can put him on Kai'Sa, let him just be this big poke mage, and if you need him to carry in the late game, he can do that. And so I really like the construction of this team. Liiv has been a ton better. Everything's really just kind of working right now for Hanwha. And if they're going to be able to keep that up over the course of the rest of this split, they're going to be a dangerous team, not only here in the LCK, but internationally as well. And then for Nongshim on the other side, again, they're in this cluster of teams now sitting at 4-11, trying to get into that final playoff spot. Nobody really thought Nongshim was going to be in that area, but they actually had a really good week number 7 and put themselves in a pretty interesting spot to be able to grab that final playoff spot. And while I do think Hanwha is obviously an unfortunate team to face in this circumstance, it certainly doesn't eliminate them by any means. The problem is that one of their positions in general has kind of just been a major issue for them this year, and that position has been the mid lane. Whether it's Fiesta, whether it's Quad, they can't seem to find anybody that's going to be able to go up and even survive against some of the better mid laners in the league, and I think that really does hold Nongshim back just in general. There was a reason for quite a bit of the split I had them as the worst team in the LCK, and it's because I just didn't see the upside if their mid lane position couldn't improve, and it continued to be a problem here. Really, both of them should be getting dud of the series. It's not like Quad came in and was better than Fiesta. I just think Fiesta lost a little bit more obviously in this series, so he's getting dud of the series, but again, it could go to Quad as well. Both of them were really bad, and both of them, quite frankly, have been bad for Nongshim over the course of this year. They have not been able to find any sort of consistency in that role, and it's been a problem. Jiwoo has been the biggest carry for this team. He's certainly been the biggest positive for them over the course of this split, and he just had to go into Viper. Kind of a tough matchup, and he couldn't necessarily hold on to that, so that's okay. I'm not going to blame him too hard, but he was pretty bad in this series. Sylvie was out jungled by Grizzly. Din is just like the worst top laner in the LCK, and Peter is just kind of there. He's not really a great support. He's not really the worst support. He's just kind of a support that's been existing over the course of this split, but Nongshim is still an interesting team. I think them and Bro have certainly proven the most out of all the teams that are kind of in this big shuffle, this kerfuffle, if you will, towards the bottom of the standings, trying to fight for that number 6 seed. I think Nongshim in particular got hot at the right time. They just kind of ran into another team that is really hot right now in Hanwha Life. I'm not going to overreact to this loss, but mid lane is certainly a problem for this team, and it's not like they have a ridiculous amount of consistent talent around them that's going to be able to make up for it. It's going to be interesting, but I do think that this team still has some upside. And then for Hanwha, they're just really good. There's really nothing else to say. This is actually a very good team. Now, are they going to be able to compete with the top 2 teams in the league? That I don't know yet. I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility for them to be a finals team. If something were to go incredibly right for them, we've seen these players be able to step up when the games matter more, not only last year with Zeka and Kingen, but last split in the spring with them being able to take down Dplus KIA in the first round. And so, some reasons to believe that Hanwha is going to be better than people give them credit for, but until we see it, until we see them be able to take down one of the 2 teams, I'm going to firmly plant them at the top of the kind of everyone else tier. And then moving on now to day number 3, our middle day here in the LCK, and we kicked off day number 3 with a matchup between Dplus KIA and the Kwangdong Freecs, and DK is going to be able to pick up the really consistent 2-0 win, and again, it's just establishing that the top 4 teams in the LCK right now are on a different level. I know people are still a little bit more hesitant about DK, and again, I understand why, because they haven't been nearly as consistent, I guess, but record-wise, they're right up there with everybody else. They have the same record as Hanwha Life, both in terms of series score, and they're 1 game behind in terms of game score. It's not like they've been significantly worse in terms of actual performances. I honestly think this team is crazy underrated right now. We see a consistent, oh, it's a top 3 in the LCK. No, it's a top 4. DK is actually a really good team, and they do not, I think, in my opinion, deserve the negative connotation that I think is associated with them as an organization. I think the only reason that they're kind of in the position that they're in terms of, public perception not necessarily being considered as fondly as a team like Hanwha Life is because I think expectations were just higher for DK at the beginning of the year. And so them being, just a good team is a little bit less interesting because it's Canyon and Showmaker and Deft, and people thought they were going to be the best team. But come on, this is still a really good League of Legends team that has very consistently been able to beat bottom tier teams and, even even really like mid-tier teams in the league. Like, they're clearly top 4 in my opinion, and so I don't really get the perception surrounding them. They played well in this one. Again, they played well basically all split long. Canyon's going to get my player of the series. Thought he was obviously awesome this series, playing the AP kind of carries in the jungle. That's always been Canyon's specialty, is kind of AP carries. Things like the Nidalee obviously come to mind, but Nico has very quickly become something that I very much associate with Canyon. He's the best Nico jungle player in the world, in my opinion, and he's really good at Lilia in game number 2 as well. Couple of interesting little, mistakes, I would say, here and there from Canyon, but some of those just seem to be, like, coordination things with the rest of the team. They didn't really matter in the long run, just kind of interesting, but Canyon was awesome mechanically basically the entire series. Showmaker was spectacular on the Tristana. I know a lot of people are talking about, there being a big 3 in terms of all pros in the mid lane, and let me tell you, all pro in the mid lane is going to be near impossible to pick, what with, Zeka and Chovy and BDD and Showmaker all playing really well, but don't discount Showmaker. I think you can make an argument that he's been the biggest carry of all 4 of them. He certainly has been super influential. I know people are starting to kind of forget because recency bias is super important, I would say, and very common in the League of Legends fandom, but Showmaker was probably the best mid laner outside of Chovy in the league through the first, 4 or 5 weeks of the split, and while he still hasn't been bad over the stretch, I think, obviously, BDD and KT have really exploded. I think Zeka's really starting to find some massive form, but let's not forget what Showmaker has been capable of doing. He's the best Tristana in the LCK. I don't even think that's really all that up for debate. When he gets this champion, it's just an insta-win for every single, against every single team that they played it against. Deft and Kellen have been solid. By the way, Kellen's back in for Bible. I don't exactly know, if they just want to try both out, if they're, trying to go one direction or the other. I think they're trying to find out who gives them the best opportunity to win. I think Kellen's really good, but Bible's a really solid player as well. I don't necessarily think you can go wrong. I just really like Kellen as a player, and while there were some miscommunications, I think his individual, mechanics this game and this series were actually fantastic, and were just as good, if not better, than what Bible has been offering, and Kana's been awesome. Very sneakily one of the best top laners in the LCK this entire split, and so I really like DK. Really think they're actually a very good team. And then for KDF on the other side, they're not a very good team. They're the worst team in the LCK. 0-2 week again for them. What is that? 8 losses in a row now. That's 4 weeks in a row that they've gone 0-2. It's not good, man. 0-4 in terms of games, they just look miserable. Everybody on this team is playing poorly. Youngjae and Bulldog, I think, have had moments. Youngjae in particular, I think, has been the one player that has actually had moments throughout the split where he's looked relatively okay. Obviously, Dudu is good as well, but it looks like he's mentally checked out. Kana was really good this series and was just better than him. But the bot side of this map is like a black hole that I just don't know if they're ever actually going to be able to play through and ever actually be able to win through. Bulldog has kind of been okay, I guess. He was okay in this series, but he's been miserable throughout most of this split, taking major steps back as a young player, obviously. Still has the upside, but his mental looks completely fried right now, and Taiyun and Andil are just by far the worst bot lane in the LCK. It's not even really debatable. They can't play at this level. I really debated on who to give dud of the series to, Taiyun or Andil. I'm going to give it to Andil because I gave the earlier one to Taiyun, but again, if you want to give both of them to Taiyun, I totally understand. He was by far the worst AD carry in this series, and he's been by far the worst AD carry in the LCK. It's just frustrating, because I do think that KDF has talent, but it feels like it's almost all disappeared over the course of this summer split. They've gone from a team that, like I said earlier, completely locked in the ability to probably make top 6 and make the playoffs, to a team that probably is the worst in the entirety of the LCK and just has absolutely no idea what to do at basically any point in the game. They don't trust themselves. They have no semblance of macro, and their mechanics have completely fallen off. This is a bad League of Legends team at the current moment. Taiyun and Andil are definitely kind of the focal point for that, but it's everybody. It's Bulldog not playing well. It's Youngjae not being a carry, even though they consistently put him on carries. And Dudu's a good player, but he got blasted in this series, and when that happens, KDF has no shot of being able to win any games. And so, I don't know, man. This is a really, really bad League of Legends team, and I don't expect it to look any better as we go throughout the rest of this split. I think that they're going to miss playoffs, even sitting at 4-12, tied for that number 6 spot, technically. I just don't see a lot of avenues where they figure it out and end up being better than some of the other teams here. And then for DK on the other side, they're good. They're actually good, and I know people don't necessarily give them that credit, but I want to give them that credit. They are right there with Hanwha Life for me in terms of, number 3, number 4. I actually do think it's more of a toss-up than people give them credit for. I think Hanwha Life has more flash to their game, and especially with Grizzly emerging, I think a lot of people are very excited about that team, but people should be excited about DK as well. Canyon and Showmaker are in good form, and Deft and Kana are playing well, and both of the supports are playing well. Everybody on DK does look good. If they can start looking great, which we know they can, who's to say this team can't compete a little bit higher than what people are saying right now? And then moving on to our second series of day number 3 here, and a battle between two teams sitting at 4 wins that very much are looking to get hot at the right moment so that they can make that run towards that last playoff spot. It was OK BRION taking on Liiv SANDBOX. And SANDBOX is able to pick up a very big win here. I think a lot of people, me included, just saw Bro as the team that had performed the most consistently out of all of the bottom tier teams up until this point, even if I've said on multiple occasions that I am much lower on them than I think, public perception is. I think they've done a fantastic job of their branding and generating a loyal fan base, especially in the West. I don't know if it's going to be the same over in Korea, but I know like Western, LCK fans are very into Bro because Bro is such a funny name, and now OK Bro is such a funny thing, and Lord Morgan and all the memes and, et cetera, et cetera. They've done a really good job of generating a fan base off of that, but I think sometimes that supersedes, I should say, their play on the Rift, where I really don't think they've been a very good team this year. They've just kind of been a little bit better than everybody else, but SANDBOX should be beating them. Like, this is not an upset. It really shouldn't be an upset. SANDBOX has been worse than them in this split up until this point, but that's a surprise. Nobody really saw that coming. This BRION team really isn't all that good. And so for SANDBOX to be able to take them down, like, yeah, it's a nice win, and it's really, really good to be able to get to 5 wins in a, situation and a circumstance where it likely will matter for you to be able to hit that 5 or 6 win mark, but, like, you should be beating Bro if you're SANDBOX, and so good for them. Player of the series for me is going to go to Closer in the mid lane. He's been probably their best player this split. I would argue he's certainly been the most explosive in their wins. Now, he can sometimes be a major problem for them in their losses, and that's always been the case with Closer, is, like, even when he's at his best, like when you look at 2022, he was given an all-pro nod in the LCK. I say it's more so for the fact that SANDBOX was a good team rather than Closer actually playing all that well, but, he would have some really good games in their wins. He would look really solid. He would be able to generate pressure and tempo, but when he lost, he lost incredibly hard, and I still think that's the case for Closer. I would argue that he's the exact same player that he was last year, and now people are just seeing what it's like when he doesn't have the same kind of talent around him, but that's just my opinion. I still think he was relatively good in this game, and again, my opinion on Closer really hasn't changed all that much. This isn't like a big I told you so, but I got a lot of comments telling me how ridiculously low I was on Closer and how I was underestimating him, and he deserved so much better. I think this is a good example of like what Closer kind of is as a player, is someone who's going to have good games, but he's also going to have bad games. He's really not going to be someone that's consistently going to get you to the top of the standings in a role in a region where like every mid laner has basically got to be a superstar if you want to be top 4 or top 5. And so Closer's good, not great, but a good game here. Willer was much better in this series. I think just in general, Willer has been super up and down over the course of this split, but I still have a lot of faith in the talent. Again, every time he's played at the LCK level, he's been fine. He was really good for Hanwha, in his rookie year. I wouldn't say really good, but good enough to be able to play off of, Chovy and Deft at the same time, and everybody else that was trying to carry that team across the finish line. But I think he's actually really solid on SANDBOX in spring. Obviously was an all-pro caliber jungler in spring and has just not been that in summer. Hopefully he can, start to regain that form a little bit. This was a good showing against a jungler in Umti who is incredibly inconsistent and, in my opinion, very overrated, but really good stuff from Willer. I think everybody else on the team played well. Teddy played Ezreal at a very high level. That's a champion that I really do associate with Teddy as a player. I think this was a pretty solid series from him. Kale was setting him up very well on the Leona in game 1. And then Clear, I think, was solid as well. I think SANDBOX was pretty clearly the better team out of these two in this series. And again, that's how it should be. SANDBOX is significantly more talented than Bro. They should be able to take them down, and they were able to do that in this series. And then for Bro, it's frustrating because you did kind of put yourself in a position where expectations had surprisingly kind of crept up on you. Like, oh, now we might actually be the 6th best team in the league, considering just how bad the bottom 5 teams had been. And so we got to step up now. We've been able to beat, DK. We beat T1. We were able to take, DK again to like 3 games and make it really close. Like, there was a lot of hype around this team because of some performances, but you got to be able to consistently beat some of the bottom tier teams in the league, and losing this series I think is definitely going to be a problem for them. Being a game behind a team like Liiv SANDBOX is not really where you want to be at this point. However, it's their first series of the week, so they could end up tying them by the end. Dud of the series for me is going to go to Karis in the mid lane. Just felt like he was completely outclassed, especially in that game 2 on the Nico, where I really didn't like how he played basically at all. Was super passive, just needed to be more aggressive. If you're going to time a lot of these engages, if you want the Nico to be a setup with the Vi, with the Nautilus, then you kind of need that Nico to be aggro, and unfortunately, I don't think they got that out of Karis. Umti got completely out-jungled this series, though. Henna and Effort really aren't that good. Like, Henna's okay, but he just doesn't do enough damage for me to really justify him being like an AD carry that you would want to have if you were a top 6 team. And then Morgan was generally fine. Clear was definitely better on the other side of the map, but Morgan didn't make any sort of major errors. He's fine. He's a good top laner, not a great one at this level, just a pretty solid one that I think would do better on a better team. But jungle mid was a problem for Bro in this series, and that's kind of something we've said multiple times over the course of this split. Karras has looked a lot better ever since coming back into the lineup after being sent down to challengers, but he's still not a perfect player. And there definitely is still remnants of, like, sometimes he's just not aggressive enough, and Umti is certainly not going to be good every game. That's just not who Umti is. He's, you know, game to game going to be really high variance, if you will, and so I think this Bro team is fine. They still have an opportunity to get that number 6 seed. Again, if they win later in the week, they have a very winnable series against Nongshim later in the week. If they're able to win that, they're still at 5-11, and that's, you know, the same as SANDBOX, and a decent place to be, I would say, right now, but you got to be able to do that. You certainly don't want to be a full game behind a lot of these other teams. And for SANDBOX, you did everything you could this week. Kind of a tough week in general, having to go up against Gen.G and then facing arguably the best of the bottom 5 teams. But being able to get a series win out of it is very important. And, you know, we had written off this team and their ability to be able to make that top 6 because of how much they underperformed at the start of the year. But, you know, who's to say that they don't figure things out down the stretch and show themselves as the best of the bottom 5? I think that's a very real possibility. And they've been a lot better as of late. So keep an eye out for SANDBOX moving forward. And then moving on now to day number 4, our 4th day of the week here in the start of the weekend, and we kicked it off with a, you know, historic matchup here in the LCK, a telecom war, a matchup between KT Rolster and T1, but it's not necessarily at the height of its competitiveness at the current moment. KT is going to be able to take it 2-0, not entirely surprising. KT's in phenomenal form at the current moment, and T1 has completely spiraled out of control. Somehow they're now sitting at 7-9, and are very likely, even at 7-9, going to lock themselves in for playoffs, which is insane, but this team is playing some of the worst league that they've played ever. This organization has never been this bad, but I think on the flip side, like, KT's playing some of the best league that they've ever played as an org. I know a lot of people are drawing parallels just in general in 2023 here to 2018, just because of, you know, Worlds is in Korea, and KT Rolster is really good, and, you know, who knows what could end up happening, but we forget how good that KT team was because they ended up running into Invictus Gaming in the quarterfinals. I think if they got almost anybody else, like, you could make an argument that KT was the second best team at that tournament and just played the best team in the quarterfinals, which was super unfortunate. Obviously, nothing against Fnatic or even G2 or Cloud9 or any of the other teams that finished above KT, but it's not like that team was, you know, I guess bad in any sense, and I think this one might even be better, right? Like, they're so good and they're so consistent, and they're so hot right now, and they continue to be a massive positive player of the series for me, and this one is going to go to Lehens, and this is going to be just kind of a general statement. If Lehens wins MVP, I'm going to be the least surprised person on the planet. I truly do believe that he is the best player on KT Rolster and the most important one to their success over the course of this split. I think a lot of people are going to give that to Keen in the top lane, and I get it. Like, Keen's really good, and I think the big difference is that, like, Keen plays a position where there really aren't a lot of players in the LCK that are dominating, and so when he stands out, it looks a lot better. It's really him and Doran, and then not really a lot of other, like, super elite top laners, but I think Lehens has legitimately been, like, the best player in the LCK, maybe outside of, like, you know, Pays and Chovy, and, like, it's going to be an interesting MVP conversation, but Lehens is absolutely in that conversation. I really do think he's been that good for this team. A great series here on the Nautilus and on the Alistar. Setting up a Vayne in game number 2 was not particularly easy. That champion is just super weak, in my opinion, at the current moment. We see people bringing her out consistently, but it very much feels like an ego pick, like a I can beat you on Vayne kind of thing, and Lehens, I think, was phenomenal on Alistar to be able to make it a lot easier for Aiming to play the game on the Vayne, but credit to Aiming, he also was really good. You know, the Zeri, I think, was awesome. It's really cool to see people pull Vayne out in a pro setting, but it's just so risky. It's something that I'm never going to advise a team to do, but when you really do feel like you're the better team, like, that's such a skill check, like, ego kind of thing, and I kind of love it, so really good stuff from KT. Love to see that. BDD was the other player that you really got to shout out. That Nico game in game number 1 was spectacular coming in from him, and I really do think he was phenomenal. Cuz didn't die all series long on Rel and on Sejuani and on these frontliners and engagers, and that's crazy impressive. Keen was really good, much better than Zeus, who really struggled, even though Keen did get solo killed in game number 1, don't forget. But just in general, KT feels like generally unstoppable after they took down Gen.G. I just don't really have a lot of confidence that there's anybody else in the LCK that's going to be able to touch them. They really are that good, and right now they're playing at that high of a level. And then for T1 on the other side, everything's going wrong, right? Like, I'm going to spoil it a little bit. I think this is the last series that Poby is going to be playing in the LCK. He ended up playing in the Challengers League game that T1 just played, or at least he's been assigned to the Challengers League roster, and he hasn't been playing in that, and so I imagine that Faker is going to be coming back, and that's going to be big for the team. But again, there are so many things going wrong with them right now. It's going to be about confidence. Hopefully they can rebuild that confidence, but it's been shattered. Everybody on this team feels completely lost. Dud of the series is going to go to Keria in the support position. I think his struggles since Faker has been gone have been a little bit overstated. I don't think individually he's been as bad as people have given him credit for, but this was easily his worst series of the year. Like, this was just bad. He got completely outplayed by Lehens on multiple picks. He was so much worse on the Nautilus in game 2 than Lehens was in game number 1, and that's definitely telling, but even the Braum in game 1 was miserable. Keria just felt like on a completely different planet from what was happening. Ironically enough, Owner was the one who really did kind of, I guess, quote-unquote step up in this series, and he's probably been the worst player on T1 since Faker stepped down, but I think a lot of that was like Owner wasn't even trying to play towards his bot side and his bot lane really at all, almost to the point where it felt intentional, and I don't know if that's like a Keria or a Gumayushi thing or what's going on, but this team feels disconnected, completely disjointed from one another, and I think it's a problem. Poby obviously was a disaster in this series going into BDD. He could not hold up even a little bit, but again, he's not really expected to be able to hold up. You need the rest of the players on this team to be good enough, and they just weren't. Zeus had a rough series, although it's funny, his one kill was a solo kill in lane in game number 1 on the Rumble, which is obviously great, and honestly, his laning phases were fine. He was just so miserable in every other part of the game. It again goes back to Zeus of like, sometimes he's gonna have really good games and really good moments, but when he gets behind, he's just really bad as a top laner. He's just one of the better ones from ahead. He's a very, I guess, interesting is probably the word to use, top laner, and I think that's kind of being discovered here. T1 just has a myriad of major problems at the current moment, and I don't know if Faker's going to come in and fix it. You know, you're kind of hoping for that as a T1 fan, but honestly, I'm concerned about this team moving forward. Again, it's not just the losses, it's the way that they're losing that ends up concerning me. It's not the fact that they're losing to KT Rolster, because even with Faker, I think this would be a relatively difficult series, but it's the fact that everybody is performing poorly, that Zeus is getting destroyed, that Keria had a really bad series, that Guma probably had his worst since Faker stepped down. There's just so many things in here that are super, super concerning for me as a team, and they've got to fix those first before I truly believe that Faker is going to completely change the outlook of everything going on. And then for KT, they're the best team in the LCK right now, and there's really not all that much debate. They obliterated this series, and it really wasn't all that close. If they're going to be able to keep up this kind of pressure, I mean, the LCK is theirs to lose. And then moving on to our second series of day number 4, and again, another intriguing matchup. All of them are here in the LCK with the way the standings are. We had DRX taking on Hanwha Liiv Esports, and HLE is going to be able to pick up the 2-0 win. Again, not a particularly surprising outcome here. There really is a top 4 in the LCK at the moment, and Hanwha is firmly in that top 4, but you know, DRX had been looking okay as of late. They were able to take down T1 earlier in the week, and obviously, they've been picking up some other wins as well, even if they haven't been all that consistent, and Hanwha just kind of took care of them. They were definitely the better team in this series. I think I really liked their game plan. They knew exactly what and how to attack DRX for a lot of this series with, because DRX has some pretty exploitable weaknesses. They have things that they like to do in games that they end up being able to win, and when they're not able to execute on those things, they tend to crumble, and that really has been a big problem for them all year long, and I think Hanwha Liiv knew exactly what to exploit, what to target throughout the game to be able to get to that point, and I think they did it really well. But when you're talking about players that have really emerged for Hanwha, the reason that they are really doing as well as they are right now, I think you have to look at jungle mid in particular. Grizzly and Zeka have both been so good over the course of not only this week, but last week as well. Like, yes, Viper's kind of the big name on this team, and certainly the one that I think a lot of people are going to look at first, and rightfully so, Viper has earned that, but Grizzly and Zeka have kind of been this team's best players over the last 2 weeks when they've really emerged as one of the best teams in the LCK, and that is a really cool thing to say. Both of them deserve player of the series. I'm going to give it to Grizzly here because I really liked how he played the jungle matchup, and that's mostly what I'm talking about in terms of advantages that HLE was able to generate. DRX really struggles with losing pressure in the early game and being able to do anything in the mid game because of that, and I think, you know, HLE knew that. HLE knew that they could attack Krako, that they could go after him, and if he got super far behind, like if you spent every single resource to make sure that he was behind in the jungle matchup, that he was not going to be able to recover, and the rest of the team was not going to be able to recover. And I think that was definitely the case in this one. Grizzly was fantastic, both on the Viego and on the Sejuani. I really like him on facilitators, but he can play the Viego incredibly well. I think Grizzly is honestly just a great player for this team. He is so much better than I could have ever anticipated him being for Hanwha Life, and he's someone who is actually getting them over the hump. And then Zeka, I mean, really, if you want to give this to Zeka, I'm certainly not going to complain. He was the carry in these 2 games, and really, I think he has stepped up and been phenomenal for Hanwha Life. He's not going to get the same kind of credit that a player like Viper is typically going to get, but Zeka, in my opinion, has been better than Viper across this split. I think he's been so dominant in terms of what he has been able to do when they win. Now, obviously, Zeka is always going to have a couple of bad games here and there just because of his Feast or Famine playstyle, but I think most of their wins, I would take Zeka's performance over Viper's. That's not to say that Viper's a bad player by any means. I'm not saying this to lower Viper's value, but rather to raise Zeka's value up, because I think he really has been that good. All-Pro in the mid lane is going to be very difficult because there are 4 incredibly deserving mid laners that, you know, somebody's going to have to get shafted, so really going to be interesting, but Zeka's definitely in that group. The rest of this team was still good. Life has really found his groove. He's actually been really good over the last few weeks. This very much feels like Life from KT Rolster last year, and that's a great thing overall. Viper's been good. Kingan's been solid. HLE is just really good across the board. I don't really have a ton of doubts about this team anymore, to be honest, other than whether or not they're going to be able to do it against the best teams in the world. And then for DRX on the other side, I mean, it sucks that you lost, but it is to Hanwha. It is to one of the top 4 teams. You can kind of expect a loss on your resume here. But again, it's just your playstyle is super exploitable. People know how to beat you at this point, and that is get the jungle behind. And it's not even really Krako's fault. He is going to get dud of the series because he was clearly the weak link, quote unquote, if you will, but I don't necessarily blame Krako when HLE puts like every single bit of resource they have in the early game into shutting him down, right? Like, what do you do as a jungler there? You have to hope somebody else on the map is going to be able to win. And unfortunately for him, everybody else on the map was also not doing all that well, specifically the bot lane, which we'll get to. But Krako was definitely exploited. The jungle has been a problem for DRX, and I really don't think they have anybody on roster that is just going to come in and fix that problem, be the solution, if you will. I think both Krako and Juhan are just kind of fine, like maybe a little bit below average. I think Juhan might be a little bit more consistent, but Krako actually has good games, and he's had good games. I just don't think the rest of this team, you know, if the rest of this team doesn't step up, it's not going to matter who you're playing in jungle, to be quite frank. Paddock and Beryl had a bad series. They kind of got dominated in lane phase. I mean, Paddock definitely stepped up a little bit in terms of damage towards the back half, as did Rascal, but Beryl was really bad, especially in game number 2 here on the Alistair. It felt like that really good series that he had earlier in the week against T1, that was a mirage, that was a fantasy. He's back into being the Beryl that we've all grown to know and love over the course of this year, and I think it definitely showed up. At DRX, I'm not going to panic too much about this loss or anything like that. They're at 4-12, which again, surprisingly keeps them in the playoff race, which it absolutely shouldn't, but that's where we are. But, you know, they definitely, you know, it all depends on what happens in the final week of the season. If they can go on this big run, and they've got the talent to be able to win some games. If they can go 2-0 next week, they're probably in the playoffs. If they can't, then they're probably not. But DRX is a team that is still really struggling, especially against good teams, and Hanwha is definitely one of those good teams. An expected result that I think went as anticipated. And now we move on to our 5th and final day of action here, and we get to kick it off with certainly an intriguing matchup. One that I was actually very, very interested in seeing. We had the Nongshim RedForce taking on OK BRION. And Nongshim picks up the 2-1 series win. Both were sitting at 4-11 before this series, and so it was super crucial, actually very influential to get to that 5-win marker. Of course, SANDBOX getting to that marker by beating Bro earlier in the week. Nongshim now getting to that 5-win marker by beating Bro later in the week, and so very, very big deal to be sitting at that 5-win marker. It means likely you're probably only going to have to win one series at the very least in order to stay relevant in the next week. And that's really nice, considering there really aren't a ton of easy games in the LCK. Like, yes, you can play some of the other bottom-tier teams, but, you know, spoiler alert, next week, a lot of the bottom-tier teams don't play the other bottom-tier teams. They have to play a lot of the good teams in the final week of the season. So Nongshim being able to pick up a win now, when it's going to be a lot easier than maybe some of their competition in the upcoming days, is a very important turning point for this team. And honestly, the whole team played really well. Player of the series, maybe surprisingly, is going to go to Din in the top lane. He's honestly been a little bit better as of late. Certainly has not been good. I don't want to go as far as to say that I've completely changed my analysis and my perception of him as a player, but I certainly don't think he's been the massive hindrance that he was for this team at the beginning of the split. He was very clearly the worst top laner in the league, you know, throughout most of spring, if not all of spring, and then at the beginning of summer as well, and it was just like, I just don't think he's ever going to be able to live up to those expectations, but he's been able to survive a bit more, and honestly, he's had a couple of really good games. I really liked the Renekton in Game 2, thought it was really, really good. The K'Sante, though, in Game 3 was really good setup, and honestly, he really wasn't all that bad in Game 1 on the Ornn either, even in their loss. I honestly just think that he was probably the most consistent player for them throughout the entire series. I think some other people are going to want to see this go to Fiesta in the mid lane, but I think Fiesta played significantly worse in game number 1. Had a couple of good plays. I certainly don't want to take that away from him, but 3 games of Annie, to me, are a little bit less impressive than a really good Renekton game and a really good K'Sante game. Not that Annie is, like, that much easier than either of those champions. None of them are really all that difficult to pilot, but Din, for me, I think stood out just a tad bit more, especially going into Morgan as opposed to Karis. I think Din, in general, just played well, but Fiesta also did play well. A lot of setups, especially in that game number 3. I think you can make a case that Fiesta was the most important player in that third and final game of the series, but I think it's more so up to interpretation. Sylvie was also really good on the Kazakhs continuously capitalizing on a lot of the things that the Annie was able to create. Just in general, I think it was a good series for Nongshim. Jiwoo and Peter, I think, were solid, even if Jiwoo did get caught out a bit too much for my personal taste. I think in general, Nongshim looked good in this series, but for Bro, man, you just so consistently can't finish the job. Like, it's unfortunate for this org, but a lot of the things that I said about them are unfortunately coming true. Their macro is just not very good, and that's the case for Nongshim as well, but when you're getting out-macroed and out-fought by Nongshim towards the back half of series like this, where it really does matter, you know, towards the playoffs, it's just really unfortunate. This is just not a very good Brion team, and I think that really has come to light in the last few series. Dud of the series for me is going to go to Karis in the mid lane for the second time this week, especially that Jace game in game number 3. He just wasn't very proactive in this series. I think you can talk about the Nico being okay at the beginning of this series, certainly better than it was earlier in the week for him, but the Jace in particular was a disaster for Bro, and I think it really was something that ended up costing them a lot in the end. I think effort, you know, also wasn't particularly good this series, even if I do think Hanwha was actually dealing a good amount of damage. You think you could argue that Hanwha was actually better than Jiwoo in this series, which is certainly something that I wouldn't have expected going in, but, you know, I think that's a relatively fair thing to say. was fine. Morgan was really good in game number 1 on the Renekton, and it felt like he was significantly less useful as the series went on. Din kind of powered up, and Morgan kind of powered down, in my opinion, but overall, I really do think that you know, it just kind of was inevitable for Bro, right? Like, I hate to say it, but my analysis of this team did turn out to be correct. They really struggle at being able to maintain things throughout a series, and specifically when they lose pressure, they just really don't have a great idea of how to play the game. I think is a big part of that. He's really not all that good from behind, even if I don't think he was necessarily a problem this series. I also don't think they have a carry. Like, they don't really have someone who can step up and, like, win them games outright. I think Henna was kind of that for a bit of this series. Was certainly inconsistent at being that, but certainly, you know, was on the table for being that throughout the series. But Karis, I don't think has stepped up. Morgan, I don't think has been nearly as good as he was in spring, in my opinion. And then, like, effort, you know, he's just whatever, right? Like, Bro just doesn't have the talent to be able to go toe-to-toe. Even with a team like Nongshim, who honestly just does out-talent them. Like, players like Fiesta and Sylvie and Jiwoo are, in my opinion, are just more mechanically talented than their counterparts over on Bro. And so even if both of them have bad macro, Nongshim is just going to be able to come out on top, and we saw that here. But unfortunate for them, they're now at 4-12. Again, they're not eliminated from anything. Things could go very right for them in the final week of the season. You know, maybe a miracle happens, maybe a Bro miracle happens, but it's just hard to predict that now. But Nongshim have very much put themselves in a good position. Yes, their next week is very tough, but really, like, realistically, they might only need to get 1 win in order to get into one of those top 6 spots. And if they're able to do that, that's massive. If they can get to, you know, 6 and, you know, 12 as we move throughout the rest of the split, if, like, they end on that, like, they're probably the 6th seed. And so, pretty good position for Nongshim to be in, which is a far cry from the horrible, potentially 10th place team that they really felt like they were for a lot of the summer split. And then moving on to our final series of the week here in the LCK, and it's a good one, a top-of-the-table clash, kind of, between Gen.G and Dplus KIA, and Gen.G is going to be able to get the job done again. It really just feels like the top 2 teams in the LCK are kind of on their own island at the moment. I do like DK, and I think they're going to get a lot of shit for this loss, and some of it's deserved. Some of these players did not play particularly well in this series, but also some of it I think is completely unjustified. I especially think some of what the commentators were saying in this game is completely unjustified. It feels like there is some just idea that DK is bad at, macro, and that Kellen in particular has no idea how to run the mid game, and I don't agree with this. Like, I don't understand. We'll get into that when we get into DK, but let's talk about Gen.G for a second, because they played really well in this series, and man, like, I think we've almost underestimated what Gen.G is capable of because they did lose to KT Rolster. If this team ended up winning the LCK again, I'm not going to be surprised at all. If they figure things out and just dominate the finals, like, yeah, I could absolutely see that being a possibility for what is maybe, outside of JD Gaming, the most talented team in the entire world. It's Peanut, Chovy, Pays, and then even Doran and Delight, right? Like, they've exploded this year, and so Gen.G's still really freaking good, and quite frankly, this was a jungle canyon, I said it on purpose this time, in this game. Player of the series is easily going to go to Peanut. He was phenomenal across this entire series. Obviously, he's really good at Poppy. He basically popularized Poppy jungle. It wasn't just him, but like last year, he was the one that was pulling out Poppy jungle, and he was the reason everybody else in the world was picking it up. I know not a lot of people talk about that, but that was Peanut. Like, he really was the one who made that pick a lot more popular, kind of put it on people's radars, if you will. But I think he was just super good across this entire series. Canyon was really struggling at dealing with a lot of the pressure that Peanut was creating in the early game, and I think that's where Peanut really shined, was just being able to generate so much tempo so quickly in all of these games, or both of these games, I should say. And yes, it took Gen.G a little bit of time to be able to close it out, because I do think DK actually played some of the early late games relatively well. Some of their team fighting was actually pretty strong. A couple of players on this team are actually pretty good at the game of League of Legends, wouldn't you know? But Gen.G just had too big of a lead at that point, and their players are also just too talented to fall in situations like this. It was a little bit of a sloppy series from Gen.G, but still incredibly good in the early game, and good enough to be able to close it out in the late game as well. Obviously, Chovy and Pays were awesome. They did so much damage throughout this entire series. Pays ends up getting another pentakill here, which is just absurd. How many of those does he have in his young career? Is he even 18 yet? Like, I don't even know, man. He's so ridiculously good. It's actually unfair how good he is for how young he is and how little time he has spent in the pro scene, but Pays is phenomenal. Chovy's still one of the best players in the entire world. Great LeBlanc game, great Azir game. Both of them were phenomenal. I think the Azir in particular really stands out in game number 2 as like one of the best games of the entire series. Doran has been fantastic, was able to go into a player in Kana who I think has actually been really good in laning phase and has been really consistent outside of it and be better. Like, Kana wasn't awful. I think the scoreline is definitely worse than how he played, but Doran was definitely better than him. Again, not surprising considering how good Doran has been over the course of this split, but, beating Kana's not easy, and then Delight was pretty solid in that same vein. So Gen.G just really clicking. They're still one of the best teams in the world. I know we're going to kind of forget about them because they're not quite as topical as they were a couple of months ago, but they're still one of the best teams in the world, and you can't overlook them at 15-1. And then for DK on the other side, like, it's an unfortunate loss, but again, it really does feel like there is a top 2 in the LCK, and I think that top 2 is very difficult to break through. Yes, Gen.G had a couple of moments where you probably could have capitalized, and honestly, you did a pretty good job of coming back after 2 really bad early games. You just weren't able to close it out. A couple of major mistakes by a couple of players, most notably Canyon in the jungle, who just was not very good in this series, and this has always been the thing with Canyon. I hate that people are acting surprised about this, and I get it. Not everybody's watched the LCK for many years. A lot of people watch international tournaments, and they see Canyon dominating, and they're like, he must be like that every single game in the LCK. But that's not Canyon. That's never really been Canyon. He's never been consistent. Like, that's just not who he is as a player. He's going to have some awesome games in the regular season. He's going to have some incredibly shit games in the regular season. Can we all cast our minds back to 2022 summer when everybody was giving up on Canyon and people were like, he shouldn't even be considered for All Pro, and I was the one standing up for him? Again, kind of insane to even say that because I shouldn't have even had to be in that situation. Of course, it was Canyon. He had good games and he had bad games. That's just what he does. But we're getting a very similar thing here where it feels like people are starting to turn against Canyon. And wouldn't you know it, you know what's going to happen? You know what exactly is going to happen? Canyon's going to be relatively inefficient in playoffs. He's going to get into the regional qualifier and dominate to get to Worlds. And then he's going to have an awesome World Championship. That's just what Canyon does. Like, that's who he is as a player, and I would expect the same thing to happen here, even if he wasn't very good in the regular season or in this series. And I still don't even think he's been that bad. He was player of the series earlier this week, and so The rest of this team, I think, actually was pretty okay. Showmaker and Deft in particular, I think were doing a lot of really good things. Deft, I think, if he was on any champion that wasn't Ashe in game number 2, you know, could have been a little bit better. Ashe, I just think, is so weak at the current moment, especially if you're not, you know, like really high damage everywhere else in the team. Like LeBlanc, Lilia can be good, but I think it's pretty easy to shut down this game 2 comp, in my opinion. But Deft was probably the best mechanical player. Kellen had a couple of good engages, and I understand why there's some negativity towards him at the current moment, but for the commentators to just come out and be like, a lot of the problems on DK is because Bible's not in and his shot calling was the one saving DK, I think it's an absurd statement to make. Like, I just don't agree with it under any circumstance. I think problems were happening when Bible was in as well, and it's not like they weren't good when Kellen was in. It's just Canyon. Canyon's gonna make mistakes like this. It's him as a player. Stop trying to blame it on everybody that isn't, you know, I don't know, man. Like, I don't mean to get fired up about this. It just doesn't make any sense. Usually you see this from, like, Reddit trolls, not from official commentators, and so it did kind of frustrate me, but, you know, Kana wasn't particularly good in the top lane matchup. He had a couple of good moments on the Rumble, but that champion's just generally strong. I think, you know, mostly it was just DK kind of getting run over in the early game and Canyon having a bad series, and that's going to happen, especially in the regular season. That's just kind of a formula that this team has had. But for Gen.G, this is a nice win. Again, you're sitting at 15-1. You're not in first place because of game score, but, I mean, there's a top 2 in the league, and Gen.G is absolutely a part of it. There is really not a lot that is stopping them from just kind of figuring it out in playoffs and winning the season anyways, and I think I'm going to be the least surprised person of all time if that ends up happening. Alright, but that is going to do it for my LCK Week 8 overview and analysis video. Up on the screen now is going to be my updated power rankings after 8 weeks of LCK action. We've got numbers 1 through 9. Any ties, I guess we do have a tie, will be broken just by alphabetical order. Of course, 5 teams now have officially locked a playoff spot. T1 basically losing their way into a playoff spot at this point, but we'll talk about them in a second. That 6th spot, though, wide open. 5 wins, 4 wins, 4 wins, 4 wins. With the bottom 5 teams in the league, it is wide open in the final week for somebody to be able to take that 5th or that 6th and final playoff spot. It's going to be very, very intriguing. But in the first column to the right, you're going to see my power rankings. In the second column, you're going to see how those have changed from last week to this week. Let's go over the biggest risers and the biggest fallers. 1 and 2 staying the same. KT and Gen.G just still looking really good. Not really a lot of complaining to do in that department. But 3 and 4 are going to swap places for me. Hanwha going to jump up to 3. DK going to go down to 4. I still really believe in this top 4, and I do believe in DK, but I think Hanwha's just really good right now, and a lot of these players are known for kind of getting better as the season goes on. A lot of these have been channel darlings in the past, like Zeka, who's probably the face of channel darlings on this channel. Him and Cream are probably like what people think of when they think of Super K-Man Rock's channel darlings, but you know, I think Zeka's, you know, peaking at the right time. He's been fantastic. Grizzly has been phenomenal. This Hanwha Life team is just good, and DK, I think, while they are good, are about as good as I thought, and Hanwha's just better than what I thought, and so they're going to move up. It's not because DK lost to Gen.G, because that was expected. I think, obviously, their matchup next week is going to tell us a lot, and I'm really intrigued to see that in both of their final series of the regular season. T1's going to stay at 5. Again, I just need to see them with Faker. They're in playoffs. They deserve top 5 at the very least, because it's not like anybody in the bottom 5 are coming for their spot, in my opinion. But, you know, bottom 5, I think, is super, super volatile. You can put them in a lot of different orders. I'm going to move SANDBOX up to 6. They really do feel like the best team of the rest at the moment. They had a relatively decent week. They were able to take down Bro, and that was a really big win to put them at 5 wins. And Nongshim's also going to stay at number 7. Those obviously are the 2 teams that have the easiest path into the playoffs because they have that extra win, but anybody can make it in. DRX is going to go up to 8 for beating T1, even if I don't think they're all that consistent. Bro's going to fall all the way down to 9. Honestly, they had a great shot of being able to lock themselves into playoffs this week and put themselves in a great spot, but they lost to both SANDBOX and Nongshim, and for that, they're going to fall all the way down to 9. I think if things had gone differently, if this had been a 2-0, which was very attainable for Bro this week, like, they'd easily be number 6, but they disappointed, and they're going to drop to number 9 because of it, and KDF is just so clearly, in my opinion, the worst team in the LCK at the moment. I just do not believe in them at all, and for a team that a lot of people had in the number 6 spot for a lot of this split, that is incredibly disappointing, but those are my power rankings. Let me know what you agree with and what you don't agree with down in the comment section below. As long as it's civil, I'm happy to have any sort of conversation. But time to jump into my player of the week and my dud of the week for week number 8. And my player of the week finally is going to go to somebody who was a runner-up like 6 times over the course of this year. It's going to go to Zeka, the mid laner for Hanwha Life. I felt like he was easily the best player in the LCK this week, and he's picking it up right at the right time, as Zeka tends to do. When he's on, when he's playing off of his jungler, when the team is playing towards him, he he is one of the most oppressive players to deal with in the entire world, and I think that was never more evident than this week. I think he was awesome. Obviously, he's been great over the course of this split, but he continues to make that all-pro case incredibly difficult because there were 4 really good mid laners in that case. But dud of the week in week number 8, again, this was actually a difficult decision because there were 2 players that I think both played incredibly bad, but I ended up giving it to Karis, the mid laner for OK Bro. Just didn't feel like Karis had a very good week. He had actually been relatively good since he got back from the Challengers League, but this week it all kind of came crumbling down. He lost lane in all of the games that they played against, quite frankly, not great competition, Closer and then Fiesta, and kind of got outclassed by both of them, which is certainly disappointing. I think a lot of people are going to want to see Taiyun here, and I understand that completely, but honestly, I justified this by saying that Anvil is so bad that maybe he's dragging Taiyun down, right? Like, I don't know. I don't know what's going on, but Karis really has no one to blame, and losing to the matchups he lost to, I think, is incredibly bad, and so Karis is going to be my dud of the week in week number 8, and Zeka is going to be my player of the week in week number 8, but that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. Of course, if you did, not only let me know down in the comment section below, but leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it helps get this video out to a lot more people. Of course, if you are new here, hit the subscribe button. We cover all 4 of the major regions, as well as the NACL on this channel, and outside of the LCK, everybody's in playoffs right now, and so it's a great time to hit that sub button so you can be notified of all the playoff matchups and kind of get a good idea of what teams are going to be heading to the World Championships. So if you want that info, go ahead and hit sub, hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.